Well, thank you for joining us today. Just to provide a kind of a preface to this event, this is the last in a series of events that the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center and the university libraries have hosted with the exhibition going on in the exhibition gallery to celebrate 25 years of the archival program. So I encourage you after you're done today to take a mosey on over there and look at that exhibit. It will be open to the beginning of January, so we encourage you to come back over the holidays, bring your family and friends with you, and check that out before it closes. So to provide an introduction today, wanted to put in perspective some of the ongoing negotiations and give some background to COP21 for those who are not aware. My name is Jason Cervenek, and I'm the Outreach Director for the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center. And we felt it was important to have this panel discussion to coincide with COP21, which is happening this week and next week in Paris. As the world continues to experience the impacts of climate change, there's a growing call for international consensus on specific actions to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius. There's overwhelming scientific agreement that greenhouse gas emissions are the cause of climate change, and in recent years, many prominent faith communities have voiced the need to protect the world's most vulnerable populations, who coincidentally have contributed least to climate change but will bear the brunt of its impacts. Through past negotiations, countries have agreed that greenhouse emissions need to be reduced, but a consensus on actions that should be taken has yet to be reached after 20 years. The Conference of Parties, which is what COP stands for, is an annual convention where delegates from governments, international organizations, UN agencies, NGOs, and civil society engage in climate negotiations. One of the main objectives of COP is to review the implementation of the United Nations framework on climate change. Previous COP conventions have resulted in significant international agreements related to climate change actions, such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Montreal Action Plan, and the Green Climate Fund. This year's conference, the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, or COP21, aims to achieve a universal agreement on specific actions to keep global temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius. It's been a pretty busy fall here at OSU. We had U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who was at the Byrd Center and on campus to see some of the research that we're doing here on sustainability. Andrew Light, who's actually one of the U.S. consultants and lead negotiators with India, was actually on campus, and we did a simulation on climate negotiations while he was here. And then Greg Hitzhusen, who's here, was able to rally the troops on campus to get Cardinal Turkson to visit from the Vatican. So we've seen a lot of speakers come through, and you've seen a lot of activity from various organizations leading up to the Paris negotiations. So this is kind of the culmination, and you've seen a lot of media coverage. Even in Columbus, there was a big article this morning, including referencing today's event. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. The first person who will give some introductory comments and provide some perspective is Cinnamon Carlarne from the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State. Followed by her introductory comments, we'll have her joined by Greg Hitzhusen, who's from the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and then Bryan from the Byrd Center, who's also a faculty member in geography and is the state climatologist for the state. And that portion of the program will be open. They'll give about 5 minutes introductory comments, and then after that we'll open the floor to questions. So.
All right, I'm going to adjust the microphone a little bit to be appropriate for my height. How's everybody doing tonight? Good? All right, it looks like we have a really, truly mixed audience. So some students, yes, undergraduate students, some grad students, yeah, and members of the public. Okay, and then some faculty members. Well, that's terrific. Well, in thinking through what I was going to talk about tonight, I first wanted to actually know who is in the audience. Because that helps me understand a little bit about what your background is or might be, not to make too many assumptions, about law and international climate change law and the role that it is, can, will, should be playing in international climate change negotiations. So how many of you are pretty familiar with international climate change law? Oh, okay. All right. I see a little opportunity to talk a little bit more about law. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background to international climate change law, but I'm not going to spend the whole time there because I also want to bring us forward. But of course, as we all know, it's important to understand our history, to understand where we're coming from, where we're going. So, of course, the problem of climate change has been, human-induced climate change has been understood for a number of years. However, in 1990, the UN General Assembly actually Can I hold it? All right, I'm going to back up because the first question I should have asked is, can you hear me? Okay, I could hear me. Okay, so I'm Cinnamon Carlarne. I'm talking about international climate change law. Back to where we were. All right, so in 1990, the UN General Assembly essentially began a negotiating session for an international climate change treaty. That culminated in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's also very important to understand that at the same time the international community adopted the UNFCCC, which is what we're going to call the International Climate Change Treaty. It also adopted the Biodiversity Treaty, some forestry rules, and then subsequently the UN Convention on Desertification. So that was a real high point for international environmental law. It was a point in time where a lot of work was done to create the structures for further action. And the UN Climate Change Treaty is in and of itself what we call a framework treaty, which means that it is a treaty, and of course I should say a treaty is the primary legal instrument that is used to create international environmental law. And the UN treaty is open to any state party to the UN. Okay, so the UN treaty is a framework treaty. And why we call it a framework treaty is because this is the essentially the initial step. It defines the problem, it defines generally where consensus exists, and it creates a generalized pathwork or framework for thinking about how to address the problem. And because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was designed this way, it was easy for countries to support. It was easy for countries to support because there were no truly legally binding components to it. Nothing that could cause a country to be penalized or force them to take action that might have economic consequences. So that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is essentially the backbone of the climate change regime, and that's the backbone of all of the negotiations that have subsequently taken place. And the UNFCCC was signed by, we have 195 parties to the treaty now, which represents every recognized UN state except, I believe, South Sudan. So when we talk about the fact that we need consensus on climate change, really, we have consensus in international law. We just don't have action on that consensus. So what the UNFCCC says is that the global community is going to come together and work to address climate change in order to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change that interferes with the ecosystem, with food services, and more. So early on, there was a fairly generalized recognition that human-induced climate change was a problem and that we needed to come together as a community to address it, a global community. And the UN treaty was based on a number of principles: sustainable development, precautionary principle, the right to development, and then very, very key to that initial treaty was the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. So many of you may have heard this term, but I'm not going to assume that everybody has. So we've seen this idea floating around in other parts of international environmental law, but the UN Framework Convention was the first to really put it at the core of a treaty. And common but differentiated responsibilities essentially means that we have some common responsibility as a global community to do something, in this case to protect the global environment, or the global atmosphere rather. I was getting even more ambitious. But then the roles and how we go about trying to protect the atmosphere will be differentiated among countries. And then the real controversial question is how we're going to differentiate those roles. In other words, how are we going to differentiate the obligations among the state parties? And in the early days of the Climate Change Treaty, this came down to breaking up the world into two parts: developed countries and developing countries. And the idea was that the developed countries would take the lead in addressing climate change really for two reasons. One, because they had the economic capacity to do so. Two, because they were responsible for the historic greenhouse gas emissions. So this idea of historic responsibility and capacity really defined the early days of climate change. And the UNFCCC treaty was really, then and now, has a very strong global support. However, what then followed is what led us to where we are now. In 1997, realizing, actually almost immediately after the framework treaty was agreed, the parties started to negotiate a subsequent agreement, an agreement that would actually create a step-by-step pathway for achieving the reductions that we needed, because the UNFCCC treaty just created the groundwork for getting there. So subsequently, at the first COP, negotiations began for an additional protocol that would delineate responsibility. We ended up in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is a more specialized, detailed agreement. Again, a protocol is a legal instrument. So this is a legally binding instrument we have. And it said that we're going to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 5% below 1990 levels between the period of 2008 and 2012. This is a long time has passed. But how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by actually giving states, as a nation states, concrete emission reduction obligations. Now, how we arrived at those concrete emission reduction obligations was a little bit of science and a lot of it of politics. But the only countries that had concrete emission reduction obligations, and this means legally binding obligations, were the developed country parties. Now, this is an entirely new agreement. It kind of hangs on to the tail of the UNFCCC, but it's a new agreement, meaning that to be a party to it, you have to agree to be a party to it. That's how international law works. Now, because the Kyoto Protocol created legally binding obligations, so in other words, asked the countries to do more work, this is when we begin to see a break-off in terms of who will participate. And in key part, this is the point at which the United States essentially drops out because we are not willing to, and the Senate through the Byrd-Hagel resolution says, we're not willing to sign any agreement that's going to put us at an economic disadvantage to our trading partners, in key part, think China and India, but also that would hurt our economy. So ever since that time, we've been in a real struggle to find a way to engage all of the key actors in the global community, key actors both in terms of mitigation, most critically, but of course those also who are going to be affected by climate change. So what has happened in the interim? So that was 1997. The protocol came into force in 2005. Between that time, we saw a pretty dramatic change in the global economy, global relations generally, but also in greenhouse gas emissions. So between the time of the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol and, of course, 2006, 2007, we saw a pretty dramatic profile change in terms of where the most greenhouse gas emissions were being produced, with emissions in China surpassing the United States in roughly 2006, which was not anticipated because we had exponential growth. And then, of course, we saw exponential growth elsewhere, especially in rapidly developing economies of India, and significant growth in Brazil, and some growth in South Africa, South Korea, elsewhere. So by the time 2009 rolls around, the Kyoto Protocol is kind of having its gasping for air because the United States is not participating. Neither are the rapidly developing economies because they were not asked to. So all of our really major greenhouse gas emitters, with the exception of Europe, are not participating in global efforts to reduce climate change. Now, I will say that while all of these struggles were taking place at the international level, there was a lot going on at the subnational level. So, for example, in the United States, we have states and mayors and regions becoming really, really progressive and innovative in thinking about ways to address climate change. But the reality is, at the international level, our big players, and particularly our big players in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, aren't playing. Okay? U.S. emissions are starting to stabilize, but emissions are growing elsewhere. So in 2009, the global community attempted to negotiate a new agreement, in Copenhagen, what was hopefully going to be some type of Copenhagen protocol. That failed dramatically. And the reason why it failed dramatically, and I can remember standing at a podium in the wake of that meeting and trying to find some hope coming out of that. The reason why it failed dramatically is because it was a point in which we were reassessing our relationships with one another as political entities. The United States was re-entering the political forefront of climate change, and China and India were kind of trying to figure out what their role would be, especially since they now have more power in these negotiations because they have to be involved because, of course, as we all know, global climate change is it doesn't matter where the emissions come from because it will affect the atmosphere equally no matter where it comes from. So in 2009, we had what we would call a failure to find a new way forward in addressing climate change through international law. Part of the problem then, and this is going to lead me into Paris, is that we continue to try to address climate change as just another environmental problem. And in particular, just another environmental problem that we could address using a top-down treaty, where the international community basically tells states, you have to reduce your emissions by X% by X date. This type of agreement was just really no longer palatable. And one of the reasons for that, coming back to the common but differentiated principle, is the real serious differences in where we are as economies. And realizing that a one-size-fits-all response won't work. Because, for example, in a country like China, where greenhouse gas emissions per capita continue to be much lower than the United States, or in India, much, 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 much lower, the idea of stopping growth and just focusing on reducing emissions is not palatable. And of course, politics keep it from being palatable in the United States for a variety of reasons we can discuss. So it makes more sense for countries to think about what is possible for them. Because achieving what is possible, even if it's not ideal, is much better than achieving nothing because of the lack of consensus. And so the thought was increasingly that there's a need to rethink how we think about negotiations. And this was really hard because this is how we negotiate international environmental law, and because most of the players that have been involved in these negotiations have been the same for years and years and years. So they have a lot invested in wanting the structures that they thought would work. But gradually the tide has turned, and we've begun to understand that climate change is much more than just simply an environmental problem. It's a security problem, it's an economic challenge, it's a free trade challenge, it's a biodiversity challenge, and also that fundamentally mitigating climate change, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, requires thinking about how to fundamentally change our energy infrastructure. And that's hard. And no country in the world at this point actually has a really solid blueprint. I don't know why you say blueprint, but I like that. A really solid blueprint for how to achieve those changes, and trying to force it from the top down with inflexible ideas simply wasn't working. And so the idea is we need to inspire creativity and experimentation. Now, I'm not timing myself, so now I'm going to say a few words about Paris, but if somebody at the back wants to wave at me when it's time, then please do that. Okay, so leading into Paris, one of the things I want to say in direct contradiction to what was said before Copenhagen, is this is not a make or break moment. And this is a moment to really take the consensus that we have and really move with it and make some change. But what's going to happen at Paris isn't ultimately going to determine everything that happens in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. It's important, but it's just a platform. So, and I will also quickly say that all of these negotiations I've talked about, all of the experimentation that we've done, has not been for naught. Because we've learned a tremendous amount in the past years. We've had leveling out of carbon dioxide emissions elsewhere, and mostly we've just done a lot of iterative learning about what we're going to use moving forward. But, okay, so coming back to Paris. So Paris is not an end in itself. It's just a platform for moving forward. And there are some positive things to think, positive ways to frame Paris. First, there's collective awareness and agreement now that climate change doesn't just pose a future risk, that it poses a real and present danger. And many of the most significant actors, including the top polluters, China, India, United States, understand this and appreciate this. Now, politically, there's division, of course, but at the highest level, there's widespread understanding of it, at least until the next presidential administration. We're going to leave that aside for a moment. So, for example, Secretary Kerry was just in Norfolk, Virginia, and they were talking about the fact that that base will have to be moved within 20 to 50 years. And there's understanding of that, there's appreciation of that, there's recognition that climate change is much more than just another environmental problem. It's integral to how we think about many of our daily activities, including security. A second optimistic thing is, again, many people do understand that Paris isn't a make or break moment and that we have to come out with a perfect agreement. There's appreciation that what we're going to do here is we're going to create a roadmap, and we're going to use that roadmap to achieve discrete improvements, and then hopefully do more learning and coming back and thinking through how to especially work on energy. I would also say another thing that's very positive about Paris is just it's a different group of actors that are really leading Paris, both in terms of the person who is running the negotiations, way more effective than in Copenhagen, and it makes a tremendous difference who's actually leading the negotiations in terms of achieving consensus and pushing initiatives forward. Now, with that, I want to just say a few words about 3 different areas of climate change: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Okay, so very briefly on mitigation. In the past, as I said, there was an effort to achieve legally binding emissions obligations, to have this kind of very heavy top-down framework with not much specificity about that. Now there's a move to countries submitting what are known as INDCs, which among the world of climate change acronyms is the one that I struggle with the most. But it means indicated nationally determined contributions. So in other words, countries are telling the Secretariat to the Conference of the Parties, here is what we can do, and here's our goal. So for China, it's to peak emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases by 2030, and to make major changes in their clean energy industry. For the United States, it's to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And for other states, it's a whole suite of things involving everything from peaking emissions to reducing emissions, different baselines, some forestry goals. But leading into Paris, over 160 countries, I believe at the end, submitted INDCs. So there was a huge willingness to participate and to put goals on the table. But really what is at stake in terms of mitigation, the most important things to do in the coming years is to put a price on carbon. This is going to be by far the most important tool in really beginning to address climate change. I don't think that we will necessarily see that at Paris, but I think we'll see steps towards that. And hand in hand with that, and what I do think we'll see a lot of discussion and movement on at Paris is really thinking much harder about integrating, communicating, pushing forward clean energy efforts. Everybody is now on board with this. China really has some really interesting initiatives there, as does India. India's been doing a lot on solar energy. The United States is starting to see the price of wind drop pretty dramatically. We're on the cusp of major change in clean energy, I hope. And I hope that what we see in Paris is some initiative on that, and also to think about technology transfer issues and funding as well. Okay, now a quick word on adaptation, and this is where I've been doing most of my work lately. So, adaptation. This is such, and by adaptation, just in case everyone is not familiar with that concept, it's the idea that we need to begin to prepare for climate change in order to become more resilient, to minimize harm, maximize any advantages that can be had, even if they're short term. So with adaptation, most of the most dire needs are in countries that are not the highest contributors in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, countries like China that are high emitters also have really significant adaptation needs. But our countries that are most in need in terms of adaptation, of course, are small island states, our least developed countries such as Bangladesh and Chad and Niger have really, really high risks for climate change. And so the key here is creating a framework for enabling adaptation, and in particular for financing adaptation. And one of the mechanisms, one of the positive developments we've seen recently is the creation of what's called a Green Climate Fund, which is a funding mechanism, in addition to others that exist, to assist with mitigation and adaptation efforts, coupled with a promise from the developed countries, in particular the United States, to help mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020. Half of that money is supposed to go to mitigation, and half of that money is supposed to go to adaptation. The real challenge is that there's a couple challenges, actually. The first is raising the money. Where is that money going to come from? And by mobilizing money, we mean mobilizing public money and private money. And we already mobilize a lot of money on climate change, but most of it, and there's two problems with it, most of it goes to mitigation and investments in energy projects because there's expected outcomes from that and possibly even profit. But with adaptation, those incentives don't really exist. And so there's been a lot of concerns about how we're going to raise the money to really fund the adaptation projects that we need. And recent estimates suggest that adaptation needs are going to be in the range of $800 billion a year within the next 10 or 20 years. So we really need to really focus on thinking about how we're going to come up with that money and what kind of incentives we can create in that area. The other challenge there is that a lot of countries are just, there's a lot of unclarity, a lack of clarity about how monies are being classified. So are they agriculture aid? Are they overseas development aid? Is the money actually new and additional? And because what we're trying to do is have new and additional monies to actually really assist in adaptation efforts. And I think that that's going to be a big topic at Paris. I think there will be some agreement on that, but I think the challenge is going to be the follow-through. Okay, last but not least. Do I have time for a last but not least? Okay, it'll be a quick last but not least. Loss and damage. Have any of you heard of loss and damage? Okay, so loss and damage. Recently at the Warsaw COP, we had the creation of what's called the Warsaw Mechanism on International Loss and Damage. I think I twisted that. But the loss and damage mechanism is intended to provide monies and assistance to those who are harmed by climate change, and it's a harm we can't avoid through adaptation. So we're thinking about countries such as the Low Islands states and others. The problem with this is that it's associated with a type of liability in the minds of the developing countries. They think we're giving money to this fund because they're blaming us, and so we're accepting a type of liability or blame or fault. There's a real resistance to that, but there's a real support for the idea that we need a fund to compensate people who've already been harmed and will be harmed. But they were kind of at a standstill and thinking about how to classify the money, how to come up with it so as to not label it as fault money, because otherwise it won't come. But I will just say in conclusion that international climate change law is a challenge, but we're really at a point where there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of consensus, and if we just allow ourselves to know that even if we can't achieve everything we want to achieve in one meeting, we can produce a tool that will allow us to work hard and make incrementally faster progress, then I think that's what we can do. All right, thank you.
So if our other panelists, Greg Hitzhusen and Bryan Mark, can join us at the front. We have chairs for everyone. I'm going to go ahead and come around and collect questions, and Jeff Dupree, one of our graduate students, is going to moderate the panel discussion. He has 1 or 2 questions to kick it off as I collect all the cards. So if you pass your cards, I'll come around and collect them.
Yeah, if we want to start just with a little introduction about yourself and maybe a couple-minute spiel of kind of your background, how your research or what you're doing is related to the field of climate change and how that might be affected now that we're starting to see some international agreements starting to take place and action really coming into fruition. So if you'd like to start, Dr. Mark.
Hi, I'm Bryan Mark, and I teach in geography. I teach global climate change. So one of the ways I'm impacted by this is seeing more students interested in this topic as I teach it. I think there might even be some of this forum right here today, getting some extra credit. Not that they need incentives. My research has focused largely on climate change in low latitude settings of the Andes, and thinking about glaciers over millennia, thousands of years, but then thinking more particularly about what's happening as glaciers are receding really fast, and what does that do for water resources. And just to give you a flavor of some of the connections that are here, I think recognizing that this is a global atmosphere that does have a forcing that's human-induced, but that really has local peculiarities to its expression. Glaciers are melting because of global warming. Water is running down to the coast right now in Peru and irrigating the deserts into a major export agricultural situation. So when you're at the grocery store, you can look to see where your asparagus and blueberries are coming from, and you may be surprised to see Argentina, Chile, and Peru on those labels. But that's a virtual water export, and that's an interesting change in what's happening, and who's profiting from that is also a really interesting story, because it turns out that not all that money is going back to local people in Peru, surprise, surprise. So thinking about consequences and fault is an interesting one for me. I'm not trained in that law, but as I conduct my research and see how lives and livelihoods at the very basic household level are changing, these are realities that we can't ignore. I'm also a state climatologist. I just inherited that position, and we spent some time at the State Farm Review this year talking to local agriculturalists and reminding them that indeed a warmer world is not just an all-around good thing for crops. By mid-century, a lot of the models would suggest that certain crop types might do a little better, but overall, that stress and strain by the end of the century will be a net negative. Also, the change in precipitation, we've already seen a noticeable increase, but the way that that's falling is in more intense downbursts. So we ended up with an interesting situation of more drier periods between higher intensity rainfall, which is a bad news scenario because it stresses crops when they need it and then causes flooding and destruction when they don't need it. So that's kind of where I'm sitting, and I'd be happy to talk more about any of those things, but I'll pass the mic now.
Thanks, Bryan. So I'm Greg Hitzhusen. I'm an assistant professor of professional practice in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and my position is actually a new type of position. Distinctly, I'm focused on religion, ecology, and sustainability. And so the question for me is, what does religion and religious and moral values have to do with some of these larger questions around, particularly around environmental policy? And so what we might say is that, generally in any kind of populace, people will only support policies that cohere with their values to some extent. So beyond the international infrastructure and the details that Cinnamon laid out so nicely, I learned a lot from hearing you talk here. So that was really helpful, I think, for setting the context for us here. But I also think we hear a lot in the United States about conflicting values. You know, climate change is almost like a culture war issue where we have conservatives versus liberals, if you will, and it seems like political affiliation determines what you think about climate science. Well, that's an interesting thing. At the same time, as you look across faith communities, which we would think would be sort of the place where people are expressing their most important values, we see almost entirely consensus across all faith communities in response to environmental issues, in response to climate change. And so, for instance, most people are probably familiar with or heard about Pope Francis's environmental encyclical letter Laudato Si. And we had Cardinal Peter Turkson here from Ghana recently, and he was one of the primary authors, kind of the main drafter of the first version of that. And so this is a really bold statement in a lot of ways, but it's not new. It actually just echoes the same kinds of statements that have been within the Catholic Church for a long time. Well, it's not only the Catholics. I mean, there's a letter signed by over 400 rabbis now that came out sort of in response to Laudato Si of a number of rabbis saying, we support what the Pope is saying, but here are some Jewish values that highlight Jewish perspectives on the environment. So there's that, and it also echoes a number of previous Jewish statements. There was also an Islamic statement on global warming that came out in response to Laudato Si. It was kind of a new kind of statement from Islamic communities, and it did the same thing. It raised up Islamic principles that would be a basis for reflecting on questions about climate change and other environmental questions. So we're seeing all kinds of support from across religious communities. Pope Francis issued some statements about COP21 and sort of the sense that, hey, the time is now. We really think this might be the last chance to get it right. Some of the language is actually coming from religious leaders. The Dalai Lama and a number of sort of the top Buddhist leaders in the world also likewise signed on to a statement that was pointing out how imperative it is that we get this right at this point. So there's been this interesting voice coming from very high levels of religious leaders saying, we need to get something done here at these Paris meetings. And I think some of the infrastructure around the World Council of Churches also has a statement with some 154 different denominational bodies that the leaders of those all signed on to support what's going on in Paris. So it made me think when you were talking about the fact that, well, we already have consensus about what's going on, but there's no consensus on exactly what action we should take. That consensus is really, really obvious in faith communities as well. There isn't a denomination, despite what you might hear in the news. There's nobody out there saying that we shouldn't take the best care for future generations or be good stewards of the natural world or deal with climate change. The National Association of Evangelicals came out a month ago and accepted the Lausanne Covenant Environmental or Creation Care Principles, which the National Association of Evangelicals is in the United States. It's an umbrella organization that includes about 45,000 congregations, 30 million Americans, mostly on the conservative right, evangelical Christians. And they adopted these principles that basically said that Christians should be called across the globe to change their behaviors and their lifestyles whenever you're contributing to degradation of the environment or to pollution. So there's some pretty strong comments across the political spectrum from different religious communities. And COP21, in being sort of this annual conference, is also similar to the annual conferences that most major denominations or religious bodies hold as well. Not all religious communities create sort of official statements and things like that, but many do. And so they meet on an annual basis or every 3 years, and they come up with policy statements. And so when I am often asked to go to a church or a synagogue and speak about creation care or speak about sustainability, I'll often look up, if it's a Methodist church, I'll look up the latest Methodist statements about the environment, and I'll come and I'll say, well, I'm really impressed with your Methodist statement about, for instance, there's a National Methodist statement that says that every Methodist building in the country should be a model of energy efficiency as a response to climate change. How many Methodists do you think know that? Not many. Because I'll say that and people will look at me like, wow, did we say we should do that? So these kinds of statements actually fill in that place of starting to say, well, here's what we think we should do. And I guess where my work fits into the bigger picture, and I actually get some help from the philosophers here and philosophers of science, there's this sort of logical fallacy that some scientists make or that the policy community will make that says that if we have the science right, if we know what's going on, if we have robust consensus about what's causing climate change, then we should be able to act. We should be able to create the appropriate policies because we know what's going on. And the philosophers say, no, that's a logical fallacy, because knowing what's going on doesn't tell you what to do. Knowing what you think we should do, having values, allows you to translate your information about what's going on and figure out, okay, well then what should we do based on what we believe we should do or how life should be. So those are value questions. So I think that a lot of these international negotiations are one form of getting those values right in the form of law, in the form of rules and laws that everybody's going to have to abide by, or that differentially people will abide by. But think too that law can't cover everything. Right? And so we have this famous quote from John Adams, one of our nation's founders, right? And he was speaking about the U.S. Constitution, and he said that the U.S. Constitution is a document that it is not fit to govern any but a moral people. Meaning, this is a good framework to give us a way to live and not kill each other and to be fair and just. But it's going to take a moral people to do this right. And where's that morality going to come from? We say you can't legislate morality. People have to be moral in the first place. And so they're going to gain that from their religious community. The vast majority of the world's people will gain some of that from a religion that they're a part of, or just from their own moral, philosophical, or other ethical backgrounds. So I think that's the contribution that I'm most interested in. It's certainly not the case that religion will save the environment or ride in. Pope Francis is not going to ride into Paris on a white horse and wave the scepter and everything will get agreed upon. But Yale Climate Project has a paper called the Francis Effect, and they studied before and after the impact of Francis's encyclical Laudato Si in his visit to the United States, and he shifted American views on climate change by, say, a full 10% towards becoming more serious and more engaged and realizing this is a big problem. So it's not as though religion changes everything, but it does play a pivotal role, and it does, especially with all of these statements across denominations. It actually provides very explicitly that level of values that says, here's why we think we should act in what kinds of ways based on the best information that we have. So I think they play a sort of a compelling partner role in all of this.
All right, thank you both very much. I have a few cards up here, and I'm sure they'll keep coming in. I'm going to combine ones that are of similar nature so that we can kind of cover a broad spectrum. And I have a few here myself that are related to these as well. So first thing I want to touch on, because it's one thing that all three of you touched on, was this moral component or the social justice component. Professor Carlarne, you mentioned that it's really the least developed nations that will experience and suffer the most. Dr. Mark, you've worked with communities in Peru that are already facing major consequences, and like you said, Dr. Hitzhusen, it's just these questions of value that are really coming into play, that there is this moral drive that's necessary to actually take action. So with that in mind, and with current state of affairs with things like Syria, and the conflict in Syria has been called the first climate conflict, and now we're seeing this issue with refugees. How do you foresee the international community responding to this, these moral components? Will that be a driver? Will that be something that will push us forward? We have a question here that says, can we use human rights issues to actually create a framework that mobilizes money for funds like the Green Climate Fund? How do you foresee that taking place?
Well, I can jump on just a part of that and then hand off. In terms of the influence of the moral dimensions of this, when Senator Whitehouse was here, when you all hosted Senator Whitehouse, he made an interesting comment. We actually asked him what difference he thought it made as a senator when religious communities weigh in on the moral dimensions of climate change, and how much difference did it make for Pope Francis to visit the U.S. Congress. And he said, well, it's not insignificant. He said that at the same time that Francis visited was right when a group of, 12 senators who had previously sort of been more in a climate denial camp signed on to a statement saying climate change is real, it's not a hoax, this is a real thing for us. And that may not have been an earth-shattering kind of statement to make, he said, but he said, I think it was no accident that most of those senators were Catholic, Roman Catholic, and he felt that, and had talked with many of them, and they felt that Francis's strong statements about moral responsibility for issues like climate change gave them, if you will, the political cover they needed to step out from under sort of a platform policy of denying some of those issues.
So I guess I have just a couple of very quick responses to that. The first, just in response to the specific part about human rights. It's interesting that the human rights regime is very strong, very powerful in terms of it being a core part of public international law. It's not really a good tool for mobilizing money, and there's also, interestingly, a lot of tension between efforts to categorize climate change as a human rights problem, given that the human rights regime is already pretty stressed. One of the other problems with international law in terms of being a helping force is that our humanitarian law, and in particular our refugee laws, don't cover the category of people that we're often concerned about. But just backing up for a moment, in terms of using the crisis to motivate, seeing the response to Syrian refugees doesn't create a lot of hope in that. However, I do think it will help, but not in the way we're thinking, not out of pure goodness of our heart, because the more we see climate change as a destabilizing force, the more we have a self-interest in minimizing that type of disruption, that type of destabilization of states, because as we all know, destabilization creates externalization of threats, many of which affect us very directly in one way or another. There's a lot of interest in minimizing that type of threat. There is, of course, a lot of goodwill. It hasn't yet mobilized the international community in the ways that we need, but as the effects of climate change become more visible, we see more photogenic disasters. The global community, it helps consensus.
Thank you. One thing you mentioned is that Paris isn't a make or break. It's not a be-all, end-all. But there is this attitude that this is one of our last chance to really make a major change and come to a legally binding and universal agreement. Can you explain a little bit further why this is different than Copenhagen? And if we come out of this and in the international community it's kind of viewed as maybe a failure or it's not as successful as we would hope, how do we go forward? Do we still approach it from the same framework, or do we need a new tool to approach it?
Okay, that's a big question. So I do think that the Paris meeting is very different in a number of ways from Copenhagen. I think that there's more consensus on the need to address climate change from more actors. I think there's more key actors that are actually actively interested in negotiating and finding partnerships and finding workable things to do. I think that there's just a lot more momentum, a lot more consensus. I don't think we're going to have a universal legally binding agreement. It may be legally binding in some ways, but not this traditional idea of legally binding top-down. I think that's a bad idea anyway, and I think a lot of people recognize that. But if we do have what is perceived to be less than successful, let us not say failure, what do? We keep pushing forward. That's all we can do. And we find momentum at the state level. We do bilateral agreements. We find partnerships. We look for innovators. We work on clean technology. We do all we can do. There was something else, but no, I forgot it. So I'll pass.
Well, what came to mind, and I'm not even sure if this fits in exactly here, but I was thinking about these make or break moments, and whether this is a make or break moment, and thinking of major occasions of social change in the past. And so one of those examples would have been the abolition of slavery. And of course, that was a long, drawn-out fight across decades and in different countries and lots of different actors. And people say, what was the role of faith communities? Well, people used religion to defend slavery. People used religion to defend abolition of slavery. But the role of sort of the moral force of things was sort of the really important question about whether this was just or not. But that was a long-term fight, and no simple answer to how that battle was going to end. So too, I'm just thinking about religious change. The Reformation is a big moment, and people say, well, Martin Luther founded his 95 Theses on the door, but not out of a vacuum. It's not like he stood up one day and had 95 Theses and changed the world. That came out of a context of, at least a century of similar thinking, and he was there at the right moment and saying the right things to kind of crystallize some of the change. So I sometimes think it sort of depends on your theory of social change and how things really change in the world, but that everything might be a drop in the bucket, and we don't know what the point is at which things will really finally crystallize and we'll have the political will to really more boldly move forward. But I think there's a sense that lots of different things help, and if you think of your different reagents in a bucket, sometimes that if you've taken chemistry class, right, and that last drip is when boom, suddenly it solidifies. And everything changes there. And I sometimes think we're maybe, you had mentioned a little bit being on the brink. I think we're getting closer to that kind of a moment. And we learn more everywhere we go. One of the things I was thinking about, though, is, in religious terms, it's the problem of being a prophet, right? For those who have foreseen the problem and said, here's how we need to solve it, and then we solved it. Or then you're going to be blamed and say, see, it wasn't a problem in the first place. If we avert climate change and everything's great, people will think you were just, blowing hot air about all this, perhaps. That's sort of a perennial issue, but it reminds me that you maybe have seen the cartoon where there's some big conference on climate change, and there's a slide in the background listing clean energy and new jobs and green infrastructure and better health and all this kind of thing. And someone in the audience is raising their hand and saying, yeah, but what if it's all a hoax and we make the world a better place for nothing? So I think sometimes we need a little bit of hope and vision in there too. I think that sometimes that kind of thing will make a difference.
I would just add a little bit of, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I want to quote an esteemed colleague, Dr. Lonnie Thompson, who likes to remind us that ice doesn't have a political agenda, it just melts. And one of the realities of these targets, these INDCs, if you add them all up, even if everybody follows them, we're going to miss the 2-degree target by quite a bit. And a recent report that just came out by a group of cryospheric scientists, those are people that study ice, have shown that those will seal the fate for a lot of mountain glaciers. In other words, if we miss that target by just a degree or two, that's a huge deal locally for certain mountain regions. And then it could also spell destabilization for major ice sheets, which would have a differential impact on a lot more of humanity that lives by sea level. So there are real thresholds in the climate system that don't really have this plasticity of saying, well, it's okay, we'll just come at it from a different angle and it can persist. There are real moments that can shift public opinion and morality and action, but it can also kick us in the butt. And I think that, unfortunately, when I look at the history of our actions, it usually takes a lot of butt kicking before we actually do anything. And I think that we need to really think about adaptation strategies quite realistically and holistically. And I would add simply that my experience of kind of pushing this moral dimension on people, when I talk to my church congregation or other people, I often get really well-meaning moral people saying to me, well, I can't really make a difference, and what about China? And basically saying, I don't agree with the premise. In other words, I see a whole lot more evil in the undergirding of capitalism or some other large worldview that would say, actually, this would do injustice if we open up this door because it would lead to all sorts of socialism, which is really evil, things like that. So that's a real reality, I think, too.
I could say more, but I don't want to. I just want us really quickly sneak in. Local efforts are incredibly important, but they're also really challenging.
Kind of on that note, to bring it a little bit closer to home, maybe Dr. Mark, starting with you, what are some of the climate effects we might expect to see here in Ohio? How will it affect our economy, especially being such a big agricultural state? And then going along with our own country's INDCs, how will that affect some of the policies that we have in place here in Ohio, especially since we have things like the freeze on clean energy going on right now?
I'll let science go first.
Yeah.
Well, I'll quickly transition because I think this is a really good point, because this is where the rubber hits the road, and this is where we all have an impact, and a differential one, I would say. So I would encourage you to be involved, especially when these decisions are made at a local level, because they really will have a differential impact on your life. I would say I could point you to some great resources, and if people want, I could we can email you PDFs. There's a climate change and impacts in Columbus, Ohio, a nice PDF in full color. This is my black and white printer version that talks about what we're likely to experience. Just to give you a couple caps here, if you think about where average temperatures maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot, like say a few degrees temperature change, but if you then think about Ohio moving itself in the winter down to Virginia, that's where we're likely to see our winter conditions become by the end of the century. But our summer is going to be more like down deeper in the south, okay? And Arkansas would be a much more realistic position to put Ohio. When you think about impacts ecologically, forests are changing too. We might see the buckeye tree actually go to Michigan. So that's another one that people can maybe grab a hold of here locally. And then precipitation changes that I mentioned before, and seasonal changes in heat indices, and other things. I mentioned the crop impact, which you might want to think about public health, because with higher humidity and higher temperature, you're also causing a lot of airborne problems. Asthma rates are increasing, and other complications to well-being. So, but I would say, on a note of more optimism, you could look at the Midwest as, yes, a huge coal burner. We still burn a lot more than the rest of the country, but that's because we have a really energy-intensive economy, which has a lot of potential for great leadership in reforming and adapting. And so I think I see a lot of good potential to where reducing emissions can come from changes in energy. And when I teach my class, I open the class saying, this is really a class about energy. It's climate change, but really comes down to understanding energy of the planet, but then also energy in your own terms of consumption and how we, this country, use it.
That's a great transition, because I recently started teaching an energy law class at the United States, at the College of Law. But what is really interesting about that at the national level is we have not traditionally taught an energy law class. We've always had a coal, oil and gas class, and then we talked about coal and environmental law, because we haven't seen energy in a holistic way, thinking about all the different sources and the ratios and how they interact with one another, because they're sectoralized and they're controlled in particular kinds of ways. And one of the things we need to do is get rid of that perspective and think about this at a higher level. But tying that into the policies, most of the policies that we have in place currently in terms of mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, are arising under the Clean Air Act, which is an enormously complicated but also very powerful piece of legislation that was passed in 1970, our first piece of environmental legislation, passed unanimously. Can you imagine that? And under the Clean Air Act, there is a very complicated set of regulations that we're calling the Clean Power Plan. And in terms of Ohio, is going to require us to reduce emissions pretty dramatically from our coal-fired power plants. The basic, just in kind of very simplified terms, the idea is that all coal-fired power plants will have to reduce their emissions such that they're equivalent to natural gas-fired units. So from a mitigation perspective, that's what we're going to be looking towards. A lot of that needs to come through demand-side management, actually thinking about how to encourage us to use energy differently, to use it more wisely, to use less of it, to be more efficient all around. But on the other side, the real side, I think, and the real important side, coming back to adaptation, is really thinking about adaptation. Now that's going to be less top-down and more about what are our needs and how can we respond to them. Everything from forestry to agriculture, also thinking a lot about water. Water is going to be really important, and thinking about how to deal with things like algal blooms and water warming, and that'll go hand in hand with also thinking about ways to minimize pollution. So there's going to be a lot that needs to be done that's not just going to be done through federal or state top-down mandates.
All right, I have a few questions here, kind of about the role that the younger generations can play. It seems that younger generations put this at more of a priority. So what, do you think that's a promising thing that the younger generations are? I would assume so, yes. But what is the role that youth can play? And then also along with that, as educators, you guys all have classes that are in some way related to climate change. What are some of the greatest challenges that you're seeing with your students? Either things they are having a struggle comprehending, or attitudes saying that, you know, me as one person can't really make a change. What are some of those challenges you see in your students?
Somebody else want to start just to share the voice.
The role of youth and younger generations, I have a great quote from Nigel Savage, who was the founder of Hitzhusen, which is this environmental organization in New York City. Really dynamic guy, and is now the largest Jewish environmental organization in the world as far as we know. And he was saying to me that his sense of what younger generations and today's college students are aware of now is really actually very hopeful. And he tied it into the story of sort of the history of the Jewish people, in that and he tied it into the wandering, the exodus, right, of leaving slavery and eventually ending up in the promised land. This was his metaphor for where we are now. Maybe we're enslaved to our dependence on fossil fuels or the current ways that we have, and these are not sustainable, so we're aiming for a brighter future to the promised land of something sustainable. And he said, the interesting thing to notice about the biblical stories of the time in the desert was that the generation that went into the desert to leave behind slavery and to enter freedom did not make it to the promised land. He said they actually perished in the desert. And the reason, and that doesn't sound very hopeful, actually, but the reason that they didn't make it was in part because they weren't ready for it. They mostly complained and grumbled and said, well, if we were back in slavery, at least we'd have meat every day, and all this kind of a thing. It was really hard to adjust. And so, but Nigel's turn on that was, he said, but their children made it to the promised land. He said, when I look at current generations, they get all of this quicker, right? They've grown up where recycling is just ubiquitous. They've grown up and we talk about environment and sustainability all the time. And even just the shift into thinking about sustainability. I mean, I think a lot of people really actually don't like that term because it seems like, oh, that's just the latest buzzword and we call it sustainability now. But the difference that I see in using the term sustainability is we said, if we just focus on the environment, that's just too narrow. We have to think about economics too, and we have to think about social inequities and ethical perspectives, and we have to be able to balance all of those pieces together. And that's at least a big part of what we mean when we say sustainability. Well, that made no sense to me when I was in college. We weren't even talking quite like that yet, but that's exactly the way students talk now. So I teach the capstone course for the EADS major, the sustainability major. And we work on projects, either with the university or with the City of Columbus's Mayor's Green Team. And we take the need for information that the municipality or the university has about trying to figure out, hey, where can we get the most bang for our buck? How can we make the most difference? What works and what doesn't? And the students tackle these problems through the analysis and using the skills that they've learned in their own studies. I find that incredibly hopeful. I mean, that already students are capable of advising the City of Columbus or Ohio State University about the best path to take. So I think I see a lot of hope in the solutions that students are already generating. That doesn't make it easy. We still have a long way to go. And I've heard a lot of people say, I'm tired of people saying, well, the next generation will figure it out because our generation needs to help that happen. But I do think that that's an incredibly hopeful thing. I think the biggest challenge with my students, as I think about this, I think that one of the things it really requires, in the end, we're all human beings. And yes, we might come up with good laws, but we always tend to find ways to get around those, and then we're going to need some different ones later. It's the human dimension of how we relate and the integrity with which we meet up with people. And I'm actually sort of concerned that some of the success of those kinds of creative problem-solving projects, of figuring out how the City of Columbus should deal with bike community and things like that, it takes a lot of talking to many different people. And if you went to the Discovery Team's lecture series earlier in the year, the woman from MIT who was talking about social media, she said that high school and middle school students now are petrified of having live conversations with people, and they're even more afraid of talking on the phone with each other because their life is texting all of the time. And you can sort of text exactly what you want. You can Facebook exactly how you want to be, but that's not necessarily reality. They don't like to talk to each other because you can't edit what you say. I was thinking, you can't edit what you say. It's coming out of your mouth. But the point is with a text message, I can just make it just as snarky as I want and finally hit send, right? And you don't like to be live. And I find that actually success in these complex problems of solving problems and needing to get multiple stakeholders at the table requires a lot of people skills of really listening to each other and being in dialogue and figuring out how to communicate what's really going on and how we're going to solve this together. And I actually think I've been seeing students less capable of that simple kind of everyday negotiation And I think that's partly because of how we're communicating more and more in these sort of isolated ways. And that may not be a huge challenge to solve, but it's something I see and I wonder about as an instructor.
The ozone hole is not the cause of global warming. Just want to make that clear. It seems to be a big problem for my students. That meant to be a light comment. Maybe that really hit home and that was an earth-shattering reality. I would echo some of those things. We challenge our students to try to think and work in groups, but facing disappointments and actually communicating is a tough thing.
I tell my students about the ozone, just so you know. I'll just say a couple of really brief things. One of the challenges my students face in the law school is the economy. And the rat race and all of these things that we think are that are fundamentally important to our lives, but that are part and parcel of rethinking how we live, I think. But these are law students, of course, who have a lot of debt, and they have the realities of needing to find a way to live. So that's one of the big challenges they face. Just really quickly coming back to the benefits of youth, and then I'm only going to be very concise. I think this generation has different expectations about what's possible. And they're growing up with less limitations on concepts of possibility, and I think that that's really good. They're thinking about who's the next Mark Zuckerberg or the next Elon Musk, and the whole idea of innovation is valued more, or at least valued highly. I just will say something. I don't know if many of you knew who Maurice Strong was, but he passed away this week, and he was a real leader in the environmental movement, formative leader. And I was at a conference with him a number of years ago that brought together all of the executive, I forget the name, the heads of the United Nations Environmental Program over the years, with people who have worked on environmental law kind of in the middle years, and then kind of this generation of environmental leaders. And what was really interesting about hearing from those early leaders in the environmental movement was how motivated and inspired they were. And then what we saw over the years was the bureaucratization of environmental issues. And I think what we're starting to see is a break away from that, moving back towards inspiration and thinking creatively, I can't talk, and being passionate about environmental issues. And so I think that that's one of the real benefits of this generation, is getting back some of that momentum of the early leaders.
One thing both of you mentioned was this idea of communication, and either the ability to communicate or the lack of communication. And one thing that I've noticed is this communication between different sectors. So the three of you kind of represent different sectors. We have law, science, religion, morality. How do you see the barriers between these different sectors being an obstacle when it comes to making some of these decisions? And do you think that these barriers are starting to come down a little bit, and that there is more discussion taking place between all of these different sectors when it comes to the issue of climate change? Because it really does have its consequences in every aspect of life, and it's not just one or the other.
I would say that things are getting better, just in my own personal experience, but I think there's definitely a long way to go. One of the problems I think that we face, even at this university, is we have a great intention of being one university, but we're stuck in a bureaucratic and budget system that really restricts fundamental interactions at a very basic level, and that influences everything that we do pedagogically and beyond. So, but learning to talk, I think, is really a matter of getting rid of a tendency to isolate ourselves. One of the ironies of our great freedoms is that we take this to individualize everything, and we lose the common forum of civil dialogue. So that's something we've got to relearn, I think, and that's going to take time. But I think the fact that we have a lot of incentives to do more interdisciplinary work, more degrees, things about sustainability, discovery themes that are meant to be solving the big world's problems and get people together, should hopefully incentivize more of that.
Well, I'll go back to some of the social media challenges I think we have. I think we have access to so much information now that it can be overwhelming, number one. But number two, the Google algorithm. and I love searching for things on Google. That's so amazing to me, right? I can find anything I want. But Google is so smart that it starts to notice the things that I click, and it says, oh, that's what he's looking for. We'll serve up more of those things because, you know, that's what I'm looking for. Which means if you happen to have a particular political view about climate science or whatever it might be, and you start clicking on climate denial sites, then everything you find will be the climate denial sites. And you'll think that you're getting a representative sample of everything that's out there, but actually Google's directing you towards more of what you already think. So some of these differences and maybe what we think of as the lack of communication about the robust consensus on climate science and why can't we get through to people is because people are in their own world of finding all the information that supports what they already think. And that's sort of built into our Google algorithm. So we may be able to need to do something like that. And there are previous eras of American history where maybe it was the heyday of yellow journalism where everybody could pay to have their views, you know, broadcast in all these papers, and we finally shifted out of that. And I wonder if we're in a time where we need to figure how to shift out of the type of rampant communication where just anything goes and you can find something supporting whatever view you have if you have whatever individualistic thought. Who's judging what's good information and what's not? So there's a place where I think the university actually has a particularly important role to play, because we traffic in information and we traffic in good information. We traffic in reliable information. As scholars, we dedicate ourselves to figuring out what's really going on and backing ourselves up with careful study. So I think, and I would hope, that that's a role that the university could stand up and play a little bit more strongly within society, is making sure that we're providing and shining a light on what are the really reliable sources of information to the best of our knowledge. And then I think working with graphic artists and others to figure out, hey, what are the best ways to communicate that so it's understandable. I think there's a lot of work for academics to sort of increase and enhance the kind of communication that can help solve some of these problems.
So I agree with everything that's been said, but I would just talk about one different kind of barrier, which is money. And climate politics and any kind of politics, the influence that money has on our political system right now, our democracy, is pretty outstanding, and not in a good way. Just amazing, really, because what you see is that money can either open channels, block channels, or direct channels of communication. And so this is really, really important thing to think about at all levels.
To kind of switch the tone a little bit, going back to if we were able to come to an agreement, and especially for the U.S., it would be essentially Obama's clean power plan, with the upcoming presidential election. That's been a worry on a lot of people's mind. And even after President Obama's speech yesterday to the delegates in Paris, many of the Republican presidential candidates came out and derided him and mocked him. Trump even said that it was one of the dumbest statements I've ever heard in politics. That's a direct quote. How obviously this would be a challenge with the overturning of whoever is in office. If we were able to reach an agreement, do you think it could be ratified? How do you think the upcoming election plays into this? How does that affect other countries' attitudes towards the U.S. at the Paris conference?
Okay, I'll start with the ratification. Nothing's getting ratified. That's why, period. We still haven't ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. We have not ratified, I don't know if you've noticed, we haven't ratified a number of multilateral environmental agreements. But that doesn't mean doom, because we're actually aware of that, and the negotiations we're doing in Paris are designed to allow President Obama to sign up to the agreement and allow us to be party without sending it before the treaty, before the Senate, because not all international agreements actually have to go before the Senate. And if we already have the capacity to implement the agreement and meet our obligations without new legislation, the President can agree to ratify the agreement, allow us to become a part of the agreement without sending it before the Senate, which I think is what we have to do, because even if it was a pretty mild agreement, no Senate that we've had in the past 10 years would ratify it, or the next 10 years, or let's say 4. But the next presidential election, well, gosh, I sometimes, from an international community perspective, if we end up with an administration that is skeptical of climate change or doesn't believe in acting on climate change, it's going to be a real hit. But as an international community, it will also be a real hit for efforts to develop a consensus and really act cooperatively. I'm hoping that doesn't happen. At the domestic level, it will be hard to actually undo what's been done with the Clean Power Plan, but only once one of the reasons why President Obama went ahead and issued the Clean Power Plan and is trying to push it through is because if it survives the legal challenges to which it's subject at the moment, then it becomes law. And it's much harder to undo law than to stop it from going through. And so that's what we're trying to do now, or what we see the president trying to do now, is actually pass legislation and regulations that will be very hard to unravel, but not impossible.
I don't have a whole lot of political insight here, but I would say that I've seen that there's a lot of polls suggesting that despite what you hear, a lot of people, the majority of Americans, do believe that we should be doing something about climate change. And so I think there's a real gap between what the certain outspoken, hopeful leaders want to report and where people are actually at on the ground. And I think that that should hopefully correct itself. But again, I think this is a matter of influence and money. I spent a little time this fall on Capitol Hill trying to lobby for the Clean Power Plan, and I realized just how powerful Citizens United is in holding hostage the Republican Party right now, really to prevent creative thinking across the aisle. So that's disparaging, but I would put that hopeful reminder out to everybody that, and this is something that I learned when Bob Inglis came to visit the Byrd Center. Is it Bob Inglis?
Bob Inglis.
That's his name. Republican who used to be in Congress, but he got kicked out because he voted against the troop surge and said global warming is real. So he lost his seat. But he came out and reminded us that political leaders aren't really out there leading. What they do is they see a crowd gathering, and they jump right out in front. Okay? And the way to change a town hall meeting is to plant a few people, just a couple, around the room with the same message. And the political person starts to think, the whole place is turning. I got to get on board with this. So once they get the message that they've left the crowd, hopefully they'll come back, and I believe they will.
I don't have much to add, maybe just comic relief and apologies to Donald Trump supporters, but I find it ironic for Donald Trump to be judging the dumbest political statement ever made.
All right, we have time for one or two more questions. One really quick, and this is probably specifically for you, Professor Carlarne. Can you explain a little bit more about the difference between a carbon tax and a cap-and-trade system?
Oh.
And if we were to come up with a carbon tax, do you think we would have anywhere close to a true estimate that would kind of really show what that carbon, how much that actually is, and could you implement that on a global scale?
Okay, so yes, I will, although with the caveat that I'm terrible at taxes. Okay, so a cap and trade regime is essentially a regulatory regime. And we're in the United States are actually the innovators of the cap and trade regime with the sulfur dioxide regime that was created in 1990 through the Clean Air Act. And it's where you estimate, hopefully with good information, the amount of pollutant that's currently being emitted into the air, and then you take that amount and you divide it up into essentially what are credits. And then you either sell or distribute those credits to the actors, the polluting industry. And then over time, the idea is you have and ideally that initial cap is already a little lower than last year, what was existing. And then over the years, you ratchet down the ceiling so that the total number of credits that are available is getting lower and lower, so the pollution is getting lower and lower. And then once those credits are allocated, then, and with recognizing that the ceiling is going to drop, businesses or whoever is being subject to this cap and trade regime have an incentive to reduce their emissions so that they can sell their extra credits. And then what you end up with is a market in pollution credits. So let's say Factory A is a really, really old 1960s coal-fired power plant. And for it to reduce its emissions, it's going to be really, really expensive. But Factory B is relatively new, and what they might might actually do is they convert to a greener source of energy somehow. And so they're able to reduce their emissions pretty dramatically, and then this encourages technological innovation. It encourages the industry to think creatively, and then they sell their credits to the old factory, who then has a certain amount of time to figure out how they're going to reduce their emissions. But each year, the number goes down and down and down, and then the selling of the credits essentially creates a market, which then has follow-up effects of creating, incentivizing technology development, etc. A carbon tax is just really a traditional tax, and it can be an upstream tax or a downstream tax. So it can be on the people that are producing fossil fuels, it can be on the refineries, for example, pipelines, or it can be on the consumers of greenhouse gases. But either way, what is essential for a carbon tax, I actually think the economic literature really suggests that a carbon tax is going to be much more effective than cap and trade regimes, as long as we can get the price right, which of course we haven't managed to get the price really right with most of our cap and trade regimes because it takes a lot of effort to actually make those regimes functional. But with the carbon tax, the idea is to make it revenue neutral, so that the monies that are being levied, whether it's on upstream or downstream, is somehow going to be even out through payroll tax reductions or through something else, so that we're trying to incentivize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but not in such a way that it's going to be regressive or have dramatic impacts on people who are just trying to get by. I don't know if that's detailed enough, but that's a quick overview.
Thank you. And then finally, we have time for one more question. To leave it on a little bit more of a positive or a hopeful note, what are some of the things that, as individuals, we can do that might make even the smallest amount of change? This is such a global issue, and a lot of times it is daunting. And you can look at it and say, you know, what could the actions of one person do on an issue this huge? But obviously, there are some things that we can be doing. So maybe each one of you wants to talk a little bit about what we can do.
Write to your representatives and get informed yourself, and talk to your family members, talk to your neighbors. But there's a lot of other things that I know Greg has to say.
Well, I don't want to say much. I want to borrow from the guy that, the No Impact Man. What was his name? Do you know this book? No Impact Man. He's the guy. It was the freshman book here at OSU about 5 or 6 years ago. So everybody read it, and he came and spoke. This is the guy who, the byline of the book is something like a guilty liberal who discovers that he's as much a part of the problem as anyone and tries to, save the earth or something like that. And his story was he was so angry about environmental things and just frustrated. He came home one day and it was all the Republicans' fault as far as he was concerned. He came home and sat down and turned on his air conditioning in his apartment and he sat there and he thought, oh, wait a second, I think I'm just as much a part of the problem as anyone else. And so he issued himself a challenge. He said, how about I stop blaming other people? How about I stop pointing the finger at everyone else who's not doing what they should be doing? If everybody just thought like I did, it would all be fixed, right? He said, I'm going to stop doing that, and I'm just going to try to live up to my own values. And I would like to try to live an environmentally neutral impact year. And so he and his family, they have a little daughter and they have a dog. They tried to figure out how they could have zero environmental impact over the course of a year, making some pretty radical changes to the way they lived. And it was really not so much an exercise in saying, I'm trying to be environmentally righteous or do the right environmental thing, whatever that is. It was a reflection on what do I think are the changes that I think are necessary, and why don't I try to make them myself? Because maybe the reason I don't feel empowered is because I don't think I can really make a difference anyway. So why don't I give that a shot? Let me see what kind of difference I can make. Can I at least live up to the things that I hold dear and that I think are important? So he did that. It's a really illuminating book, and it actually was some of the moral changes and struggles that he discovered that I think were the most interesting. And so I guess that would be the one thing I would say is think about your own values and make a genuine effort to live up to them. It's a huge challenge, but it also is incredibly empowering to just start doing what you really think you should be doing. And I think that then maybe collectively provides some hope and some inspiration for some of the bigger challenges.
Okay, so I'll second all of those things and just add a few. Coming back to a theme that we've talked about a bit here, communication. I think if you're thinking about these issues, talking about them, communicating, educating yourself, trying to educate the people around you in a way that's accessible and not patronizing, but just talking about the world in which we live in, I think that that's really important. And I also think education in schools for young children is really important. But if you want to talk about really discrete things, I have a couple of ideas because it's always fun to have something you can work with. Fly less. If everybody took one fewer flights per year, I mean, it's an amazing difference. Air flight is hugely impactful. You know, I'll be like Jimmy Carter, and I'll tell you to wear a sweater. Turn your thermostat down. Put a sweater. You guys, nobody recognizes that. Put a sweater on, right? You don't need to overcool your house or overheat your house. Another big thing from my perspective is eat less meat or no meat at all, right? The meat industry is really carbon intensive, as well as creating a huge amount of environmental problems, pollution problems, really a lot of contamination of water problems, but also it's just really carbon intensive. So you have a meatless Monday. And I just really think about ourselves as a community and not as a bunch of individuals. And the more we think of ourselves as a community, I think the better we'll do. We think about ourselves in relation to other people.
All right. Well, thank you to all three of you for being here, for answering these questions. I found it very illuminating, the topics that were discussed, and hopefully everyone else did as well. So thank you to all three of you.